Hello! So in this video, we are going to be using multiple statements, multiple conditions within an if statement. So if you remember in the last video, we said an if statement is just basically saying, if this is true, do this, else do this. Okay, and we used an example and we came up with this nice little function which would basically tell us the sign of a number. So we gave it a number and then R would return it what the sign of that number was, whether it's positive, negative or zero. What I'm going to do now is say, well, if this is true and this is true, then do this, else do something else. Or I might say, if this is true or this is true, then do this, else do something else. So basically I'm testing multiple conditions, not just one anymore. And I'm going to use this function which I wrote in the last video, which is all about telling us the sign of the function, to tell us what happens when we multiply two numbers together. So what the sign of the product of two numbers would be. So we know, for example, that a positive times a positive is a positive, a positive times a negative is a negative times a negative is a positive, and any number times zero is always zero. So I want to basically come up with a function that would tell us the sign of the product of two numbers. So let's keep it in the same script file as I used before, and actually I'm going to be using this sign function which I wrote in the last video within it, because I need to know the sign of the number in the first place. So let's put a few lines between us and the sign function, and let's create a new function. Let's call it mult sign. Just basically it stands for what's the sign of the number when we multiply two numbers together. It's going to be a function. Okay, and I'm going to give it two numbers. So I'm just going to call it number 1, comma, number 2. Okay, so NO1, NO2. And these are just the two numbers which the user will give me. Okay, so let's create that function. Let's open our brackets and close our brackets. Put lots of lines in between us and the end there. Okay, so first of all, my first condition is to basically say, well, I need to test the sign of the number. That's easy enough. I can just run it through my sign function, which I wrote in the last video. That's fine. And I'm basically going to first of all say, if I've got a positive times a positive, then the result is going to be a positive. So if both numbers are positive, then I want it to print positive numbers. So if I'm going to open my parentheses, and I'm going to open, I've got my parentheses open, and I'm going to open another set of parentheses in there, because first of all, I want to say if the sign of number 1. So what that is basically saying is take number 1, my first number which I put in, and run it through the sign function. Okay, and then if that equals, now I need to use two equals here. It's a little bit funny because if you remember right back at the start when I said how we define a number, or how I store a value, I can say x equals something. So this is slightly different here. I'm asking if that number is equal to something else. So I'm actually asking something, so I have to use two equals. And if that's equal to, right, okay, I'll come into a little bit of problem. Not too much of an issue. Basically, with my sign function up here, I'm getting it to just print the negative number, or whether it's a positive number or the zero number, as text, okay? What I want to do instead is I want it to save a value into R. Right, okay. So let's say, for example, if it's a negative number, so I no longer want it to print, okay? But I no longer want it to print, but I can still comment the code to remind myself that that is a negative number. Okay, if it's a negative number, then let's just say we store the value 1, okay? If it's the positive number, so hash positive number, just to remind me that that is the positive, that's the positive code, then let's say, for example, we store the value 2, and if it's 0, then let's just store the value zeros. Okay, so basically now it's no longer going to print to the console when I run my multiply sign function. Because remember, now I'm not interested in the sign of the function. I don't want it to print the text anymore. I want it just to store a value because I want to actually do something with this function now. Okay, so if it's negative, it's going to output the number 1. If it's positive, then the function is going to output the number 2, and if it's 0, then it's just going to output 0. Right, okay. So if the sign of number 1 is positive, so positive corresponds to 2, okay, and I want to make sure they're both positive, so I'm going to say and, I'm going to open another set of parentheses and say, and if the sign of number 2, so I'm going to put number 2 through my sign function, and if that also comes out as 2, so they're both positive, so let's just put hash and remind ourselves that both positive, just to remind ourselves that they're both positive. Open up my if function, there's my curly brackets, Okay, then what I want it to do is I want to print, well, if it's a positive times a positive, then it's going to be a positive. So print, then with my quotation marks, tell it want to print text, print positive number. Okay, cool. Right, so now let's test another statement. Well, what else can we have? Well, what happens if they're both negative? Then that's going to be positive as well, isn't it? So else if, so basically it's going through, my R code is going to go through, it's going to test this first condition. Are they both positive? If they are, then it's going to be printing this text positive number. Otherwise, it's going to run this next statement. It's going to check this next statement. Else if, so I open my parentheses. Else if they're both negative. So I need to say sign of number one. So I've put number one through my sign function, and if that comes out as negative, which was 1, wasn't it? Yeah, so negative number comes out as 1. Okay, so sign of number 1 equals negative, and open another set of parentheses, and sign of number 2 is also negative, so also 1. So just remind myself, they're both negative. Then I want it to print, so open my curly brackets, then I want it to print positive number, isn't it? Okay, cool. So basically what that says, what I've written so far, is I want it to go through. I want to take number 1, put it through my sign function. If that comes out as 2, then that's positive. Okay, and when I run my number 2 through my sign function, then if that comes out as positive as well, then it's going to be a positive number. Then do this. Then if they're not both positive, then I'm going to test if they're both negative, and then I'm going to print positive number because the product of 2 negative numbers is positive. Okay, let's go again. I need to also test if one of them is 0, of course. So else if one of them is 0. So either sign of number 1 is equal to 0, or sign of number 2 is equal to 0. So open my parentheses. So sign of number 1 is equal to 0. Or, now the OR symbol, so up here with the AND symbol, it was just the AND symbol. The OR symbol is shift backslash. It's that symbol line. It's the absolute value sign. If, and then I need to test if sign of number 2 is also equal to 0. So 1, 0. So basically, any number times 0 is always 0, so I know the result. So if I just open my curly brackets, open my curly brackets, then I want it to print 0, again with the quotation marks. Okay, now let's just make sure I've got everything. So if they're both positive, so I run my numbers through the sign function. If they're both positive, then I want it to print positive number. If they're both negative, then I also want it to print negative number. Otherwise, if one of them is 0, so if either sign of number 1 is 0 or sign of number 2 is 0, then I want it to print 0. Okay, or I can have the case when the only other case left is if one of them is negative, then therefore it's going to be just negative. So else, I don't even need to write anything else. Print negative number. Okay, cool. That should work now. Let me just double check. Yeah, okay, cool. That should work. Let me just continue with the code, with the commenting. So the last case is if one of them is negative. Okay, that's the only other case left. So 1 negative. So let's source this and see if this works. So here we go. Let's source. Let's run our function, which is mult sign. Okay, and then I just need to put in 2 values. So let's put in 2 positive numbers first of all. So let's put in 2 and 4, both positive, and we should expect R to print positive number because a positive times a positive is positive. And hey, that works. Let's try again. Let's put one of them as negative just to try and, or let's put them both as negative first of all. So it should be positive again. Yeah, great, that works. Okay, let's put one of them as 0. So this should come out as 0. And it does. Okay, let's now put both, let's now put 1 positive, 1 negative, and it comes out as a negative number. So hey, that works. This is an example of multiple condition if statements, okay? And also what's really nice about this is it's reusing a function which I've already defined up here. The only thing which I've had to change is I'm no longer printing an output from this sine function, okay? So if I wanted to print an output from the sine function, I basically have to rewrite a new function like I did before in the previous video, just call it something else, okay? And then just use that function, but that's not an issue. So basically, I'm using a function that I used in my last video, and I'm basically just using now that function to come up with something that tells me what the sine of two numbers being multiplied together is going to be. It's great.